All right, so yesterday we talked about naming ionic compounds, and we said that there's two types of naming depending on the identity of your metal, right? So if you've got a group 1A or 2A cation, that the naming's really simple. You just have your cation go first, followed by your anion with an IDE suffix. And so we had examples like potassium oxide, calcium nitride, calcium sulfide, etc. With transition metals, we had to be a little bit more specific because that cation doesn't have a definite charge. It can vary a little bit. So you typically have your cation followed by a Roman numeral indicating the charge of your cation, and then your anion with an IDE suffix. And the key thing is you've got to make sure that your cations bounce out your anions. And then we went on yesterday and we talked about polyatomic ions. A few people asked me, do we have to memorize these? Yes. You have to memorize the name, the formula, and the charge. I know it's a lot. What I typically recommend is use this Quizlet link. You can even pull it up on your phone, do it before bed every night. If you just do it like once a night before bed, it's usually not that bad. You can get it done within a week memorizing these. The reason I want you guys to memorize these is if you go into a healthcare field, you'll oftentimes hear these polyatomic ion names. So you need to make sure you know what they are. So there's that Quizlet link. All of the highlighted ones are the ones you're supposed to know. And these are kind of the weird exception where sometimes we run into examples where we don't have a metal, but we do have a polyatomic ion. So in the case of ammonium chloride, those are all non-metals, but it's still considered ionic. And then, last but not least, we made this flowchart for being able to determine naming. We said first you need to determine if your compound is ionic or covalent. Covalent compounds we know only have nonmetals, and they do not contain one of the polyatomic ions that we highlighted. And then we said if it's a covalent compound, we typically have our first atom followed by our second atom with an IDE suffix, and we need to include prefixes with the exception of mono for the first atom. If it's ionic, that means we've got a metal in there or a polyatomic anion or cation. And then we've got the two naming systems depending on whether or not we have a transition metal or just a plain old metal. And we had some examples here as well. So we went through and did a couple of examples, but I want to throw you guys a harder example before we jump into our practice activity. Let's do calcium phosphate. And I want you guys to give me the formula. So do you think this is going to be ionic or covalent, first of all? What do you guys think? Ionic? Why is it ionic? It's got the metal, right? First thing you always look for is that it has a metal. In this case, it's in group 2A, so we're going to go with the simple naming. We don't need a Roman numeral, right? Okay, so we'd say calcium has what charge? Positive 2, okay. 2 plus, all right. And then phosphate over here, that's one of our polyatomic ions. What's the molecular formula for phosphate? It's a tricky one. PO4 3 minus, right? Okay, now the tricky part is combining this into a molecular formula. We need to make sure that our charges bounce out. How do we do that? Yeah, the simple trick I showed you guys is take this number. It's going to become the subscript after the calcium. And then this 2 is going to go after the phosphate. So let's take a look at this, and we'd say, all right, the calcium should have the 3 here. And then a common mistake I see students make is they say, all right, we've got 2 PO4s, and so I'll write it like that. Does that look right? No, that looks like you have 42 oxygens. What's a good solution? Parentheses around the PO4. If you've got more than one of your polyatomic ions, make sure you bracket the entire polyatomic ion and then put how many of them you have outside of the brackets. So in this case, this would be calcium phosphate. It does get a little bit tricky. You don't need to include the parentheses if you only have one of the polyatomic ions, but if you have more than one, please include the parentheses. So what I've got for you guys up front, if you haven't grabbed it already, is a big old long practice worksheet. I know you guys haven't memorized the polyatomic ions yet, so I've got the cheat sheet on the front side. And then on the back, I've got chemical compounds. I want you guys to give me the names. And then on the other side, I've got the the name, and I want you to give me the formula. So work through this with the partner and make sure you guys agree on it. And then after we're done, we'll check in and make sure everybody's on the same page.